Hello there, and welcome to Library. I am Jaren, your internet librarian, and today we are going to take a trip into history. My history and the world's history. In particular, I am going to be doing a cold read of a paper that I did in university at the grad level on the impacts of Nazism on books and libraries. Introduction. The Bibliocaust, a term coined by Time magazine during the Nazi era, was an integral part of what could be argued to be the greatest effort at cultural pillaging in history. Its effects are still felt around the world today, and yet it has often been forgotten in our cultural memory of World War II. In contrast to D-Day, Hitler's plans for Germania, and a number of other topics, the story of books and libraries in Nazi Germany and occupied Europe has received very little coverage. One needs only to watch the History Channel. Well, okay, so here's my, here's current me. Or go to any bookstore to become familiarized with the more common histories of World War II. Although I gotta say, History Channel on D-Day, awesome, love it. In this paper, I will, as much as possible, provide an informative introduction to the Bibliocaust and its aftermath. I shall begin this paper's exploration of books and libraries under the Nazis with a brief introduction to their typical fates, and will continue by discussing the book burnings staged on May 10th, 1933. These book burnings, particularly the one staged at Berlin's Opernplatz, were the symbolic beginning to the cultural destruction that would follow throughout Europe in World War II. This and other Nazi actions could not have been accomplished without the aid of librarians. Therefore, I will follow the book burnings by looking at some of the roles that librarians played in Nazi Germany and Nazi Europe. Those who betrayed the ideas of their profession, sadly, made great contributions to the Nazis' efforts and the Bibliocaust. In the arena of cultural pillaging, the actions of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, were arguably the worst, and today the best remembered of any organization operating in World War II Europe. It is for this reason that I have devoted a substantial portion of this essay to the ERR. Yeah, I'm not pronouncing that one again. A key recurring theme throughout both the literature and the war itself is the contrast between Eastern and Western Europe, both during and after the war. Throughout my review of the literature on books and libraries in Nazi Europe, I noticed that the Nazis treated Eastern Europe, its peoples and cultural wealth, far more harshly than Western Europe. Although I cannot provide all of the stories and statistics that I have found in my research in this short paper, I would be remiss to ignore the existence of an East-West disparity in Nazi treatment. The final topic that I explore elaborates on the East-West theme. In this case, I specifically address efforts made by the Allies to preserve Europe's books and other cultural artifacts during and after the war, with a particular emphasis upon restitution efforts. After the war, with Eastern Europe occupied by the USSR and Western Europe being occupied by the Western Allies, US, Britain, France, there was a significant difference in restitution efforts undertaken by the victors, and thus the theme of East-West disparity reappeared. While Nazi treasure troves of books and other cultural artifacts that came under the control of the Western Allies were carefully sorted out as much as possible, and returned to their rightful owners in Western and Eastern Europe, those that were in Soviet-occupied territories belonging to people and institutions throughout Europe were claimed as trophies of war. 3 typical fates. Books that were targeted by the Nazis in Germany and later occupied Europe typically received one of 3 fates: burning, pulping, or confiscation by use of the party. Of course, I changed it to the party this far in. This is the first video that I'm recording. It might not be my first video posted, but there is no way that it is going to be no way that it's going to be monetized with Nazi showing up so early in it, I'm sure. Anyways, the burnings, as noted above, had their symbolic beginning at the Opernplatz in 1933. However, book burning would continue to be practiced by German troops throughout the war. A prime example of wanton destruction by burning, noted in my research, was the burning of Leo Tolstoy's books in 1942. While occupying the estate, by then a museum, of Leo Tolstoy, German troops took to burning its books. When one of the curators suggested finding logs to burn in the fireplace, a German officer replied, "We don't need a wood fire. We are going to burn anything connected with the name of your Leo Tolstoy." Pulping was done meticulously throughout the war. During the war. Doesn't really matter. As indicated by one German report, which states that 651 metric tons of printed materials had been pulped in the occupied East in 1943 alone. Materials that were considered valuable to the Nazi Party, for instance, Jewish items that could be used by the Hochschule, don't know if I have that pronunciation right, but were confiscated and taken to repositories by bodies such as the ERR. Not saying that again. It was through these different actions that millions of books throughout Nazi Germany and occupied Europe were lost, whether forever or temporarily. Book burnings. Before looking at Nazi subjugation throughout Europe, it is important to explore the Nazi activities in pre-World War II Nazi Germany, with a particular focus upon Nazi book burnings. Today, these events are recognized as a prologue to the Bibliocaust that followed, and have been addressed by a number of authors that I reviewed in my research for this essay. However, in the period before World War II, they were not properly recognized as indicators of coming events. They say what's past is prologue, and we still seem to forget that. On May 10th, 1933, a theatrical book burning was staged in Berlin's Opernplatz, with its prime orchestrator, Joseph Goebbels, in attendance. The burning at the Opernplatz began at 10 p.m. and was a theatrical spectacle of music and flame. University students came into the square following the stormtrooper band, and firemen set fires with gasoline. Truckloads of books were delivered, and, quote, "The students formed human chains to cast them into the flames," end quote. And, quote, "With each new packet of books cast into the flames, a voice declared the name of the implicated author and pronounced the sentence of execution," end quote. Although the details of the Bücherverbrennung had remained secret until the night of May 10th, it quote, soon revealed its true dimensions, end quote, as concurrently in cities throughout Nazi Germany, similar book burnings were being staged. Today at the Opernplatz, now known as the Bibliocaust, is home to a monument that memorializes the events of May 10th, 1933. It remembers the events for their horror and for the horrors that they foreshadowed. The burnings, as implied above, were not spontaneous outbursts. For the month prior to the burnings, student groups within Germany's universities had been collecting blacklisted books through donation and confiscation from individuals and library stacks for the purpose of these burnings. Rather than recognizing these as an affront to free thought, the international response to this would typically range from a certain understanding to, at worst, condescending mockery. They really didn't recognize it for what it was. It was common in the contemporary press for reports to compare the acts of these students to the tradition among American students of burning textbooks upon graduation. Okay. We're definitely in a different period now. I know that I did not burn my textbooks upon graduation. I actually resold a bunch of them back to the university, and I kept some that I found particularly interesting. I don't have that kind of money, but clearly students at this time, well, it was a different demographic, let's say. Okay, where was I? A British essayist, Osbert Sitwell, that's a British name if I've ever heard one, went so far as to ask his readers, in reference to burnings that occurred in England during World War I, quote, "Who can ever forget those enjoyable bouts of newspaper burning?" More negative reports stated, quote, "For heaven's sake, stop being the eternal Peter Pan among nations. Grow up and show a little adult common sense about your own best interests," end quote. And the, quote, "IQ of the Hitler movement can hardly rate anything above 6 years of age. And at that stage, any one of us would like to dress up in a uniform and play with matches," end quote. Okay, I've got 4 kids. No. They're smarter than this. At least I should hope they're smarter than this. Kids, if you're watching this in 20 years, be smarter than this. In total, between 20 and 25,000 books were burned on the night of May the 10th, 1933. Although the warning signs were largely ignored, the destruction that would follow throughout World War II had been clearly foreshadowed. Oh, I'm not going to like this. I don't remember much of my writing of this essay. I remember its existence. I remember some of the research. Oh, but I forgot about including this section. Okay. Librarians. Despite now being remembered as book burners, it is important to stress that the Nazis saw the importance of libraries early in their rule. This was particularly true of public libraries. Therefore, in order to spread Nazi ideals to the masses, the government substantially increased the number of public libraries in Germany. Libraries could not be operated without librarians on staff, and thus the retaining and indoctrination of existing librarians was essential to the Nazis' plan to censor the wrong kinds of literature and replace it with the right kind of literature. Even cataloging changed in Nazi Europe. I remember this. This has stuck out to me. as librarians under the Nazis employed a cataloging system based on the ideals of the party regarding racial theory and nationalism. Certainly, however, not all librarians in Germany and later occupied Europe capitulated to the Nazis' indoctrination. For instance, at least, quote, 3/4 of all librarians who directed scholarly libraries left their positions or were forced to resign during the 5 years following the establishment of the Nazi regime in Germany, end quote. I added the in Germany. This is a little bit different reading out an essay. It's very different. It was those who remained that carried out the party's wishes to remove blacklisted materials from their shelves. Sadly, many of the directors of Germany's libraries remained at their posts simply, quote, in order to extend their work or avoid interruption of their scholarly work. Librarians such as these, operating in Germany and occupied Europe, were themselves among those who created the blacklists. Beginning even before the war, German librarians traveling abroad had been creating, quote, lists of desirable materials which were to be secured for German use, and undesirable materials which would be destroyed in the Germanification effort, end quote. The identities of these books will be discussed later. A number of pre-existing German libraries and newly established libraries were chosen to receive books that had been, as noted above, quote, secured for German use. Some of these libraries included the Library of Frankfurt's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question, the Hochschule, the Library of the Chief Security Office, and the Ostbucherei Rosenberg. The librarians and support staff in these institutions were integral to the Nazis' efforts to destroy the cultures of those conquered by the Reich in World War II. I vaguely remember this, but I just don't have words. And now we move on. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR. It is important to look at the mechanisms with which confiscations and destructions of books were carried out. Alfred Rosenberg's Einsatzstab, or operational staff of Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, was not the only organization committed to looting in Nazi-occupied Europe. For instance, much of the looting of libraries and bookstores in Poland, the most extreme example of Nazi looting, was executed by the occupation government's, more German. I'm just going to read the translation, sorry. Department of Propaganda Administration of the General Government. However, it has been Rosenberg's infamous ERR that has had the most lasting memory. It is because of the ERR's lasting memory and its dedicated purpose of looting cultural artifacts from all over Europe that I have chosen to examine it rather than any other organization. Although the ERR is often remembered for its looting of art for Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler, its original purpose upon being established in 1940 was, quote, to search and seize libraries and archives in order end quote, in order to provide materials for Frankfurt's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question, which would be integrated into the Hochschule, a proposed university for the Nazi elite. Okay, I'm going to be critical of myself. I couldn't have added that note the first time I brought it up. Like, come on, past Sharon, what's wrong with you? After the war, ironically, although the ERR condemned many books to be destroyed, such as books published in Hebrew after 1800, it was also responsible for saving many books that would have been burnt by Goebbels. Indeed, the Rosenberg and the ERR emerged as Goebbels. Okay, I think it's indeed Rosenberg and the ERR. Whoops, typo. Caught that a few years later. Emerged as Goebbels' only rival. The ERR collected books under the protection of the Wehrmacht, and in both its Eastern and Western European operations was considered to be part of the Wehrmacht. In the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, however, the ERR often had to rely upon the security police to carry out their confiscations. This left the agency vulnerable when other agencies demanded that the security police relinquish confiscated items to them instead of the ERR. Despite such weaknesses, the ERR was able to procure millions of books, a number of which were thereby inadvertently preserved for their rightful owners, as noted above. The ERR confiscated books, archives, and artwork throughout Europe based upon a number of motivations, ranging from orders to create a library for Rosenberg's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question to satisfying Hermann Goering's taste for expensive artwork. In the end, many of these confiscated items were discovered in a series of 1,500 repositories. Among the more notable examples of such repositories were those found in the salt mine at Althaus. Sorry if I got that wrong. Which contained, among paintings and other plundered artwork, 181 cases of books. Whew. And, quote, 1,200 to 1,700 cases of apparently books or similar. And the sorting center at Ratibor, which had become the central point of operations for the ERR after it had abandoned working in Berlin as a result of the bombing raids. Regardless of motive, the enormity and inherent evil of the ERR's operations cannot be understated. Operations and the East-West disparity. The confiscation and destruction of library holdings and private collections, particularly those of the subjugated Jewish populations, was a particularly dark activity, carried out by the Nazis in World War II. Throughout occupied Europe, Jewish books were considered, quote, enemies of the people, many of which were pulped while their owners were, quote, reported. In total, more than 3/4 of Europe's estimated 3,300,000 Jewish volumes were eventually destroyed. However, it is important to stress that with the exception of the Jews, who were treated with equal inhumanity throughout Europe, the Nazis treated the peoples and books of Eastern and Western Europe very differently. This point has been noted by numerous authors in my research, such as Fishburn and Knuth. Fishburn puts it more eloquently, stating that, quote, in Western Europe, the general rule was that tampering with library holdings was, at least by Nazi standards, fairly subdued. whereas no such restraint was shown in Eastern Europe, end quote. Rebecca Knuth adds the points that, quote, whereas the Slavs of Eastern Europe were deemed inferior, end quote, and quote again, Western Europeans were assigned greater value, end quote. And the quote again, this looks great when you read it, but like reading it out loud, not as easy. And the quote, use of violence to culture in each region was proportional to the racial value assigned to each nation's people, as well as the degree of resistance encountered, end quote. The latter practical reality explains the Germans' destruction of British cultural treasures despite their, quote, admiration for the British race, end quote. Looking at the case of Poland in Eastern Europe in comparison to France and Western Europe illuminates this disparity between these two regions. Following the invasion of Poland in 1939, quote, not a week went by without an attack on a Polish library or museum, end quote. On December 13th, 1939, an official order was published which decreed that all libraries and all public and private libraries were to be surrendered. With this single order, 2 million books were immediately seized. After the war, it was estimated that roughly 70 to 80% of the country's public library volumes, more than 16 million, had vanished. In 1944, when the tide of war turned against Germany, squadrons of German troops set fire to the most prestigious of Poland's libraries. While it would be disingenuous to state that the books and libraries of France and Western Europe, as a whole, were left untouched by the Nazis, the case of France should adequately illustrate the comparative ease with which Western Europe was treated. Okay, I don't know if I would write that into a YouTube script, but this was originally meant just for my university instructor to read, so sorry, Western Europe. The Nazis were awful everywhere. Looking at the ERR confiscation list shows that France experienced the greatest number of confiscations in Western Europe. This is not entirely surprising, as Paris itself was the base of ERR operations throughout occupied Western Europe. ERR confiscations amounted to 1,767,108 books in occupied France. Unfortunately, my research has not yielded an overall estimate of books lost in France. However, comparing the total number taken by the ERR in France to the 2 million taken in Poland in a single action indicates the disparity between these regions. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. The Allies and restitutions. Before discussing the recovery and restitution efforts undertaken by the Allies, it must be noted that they were not without blame for the destruction of books and other cultural treasures in World War II Europe. Knuth clearly explains the impact of Allied bombings, particularly British nighttime raids on Germany, stating that, quote, the Germans suffered irreparable losses to their print heritage, end quote. Additionally, with regards to the restitution of cultural treasures, those found in Eastern and Western Europe met very different fates, just as those regions had met with very different treatment during the war. Beginning with the East, Stalin authorized the creation of trophy brigades, which would transport, quote, tens of millions of trophy books to the USSR between 1945 and 1948. Although many of these books had originated from the USSR, there were millions that did not. For instance, Grimsted explains, quote, in the fall of 1945, an echelon of 54 freight cars arrived from Silesia in the war-torn Belarusian capital of Minsk, bringing over 1 million library books. Half of them had been plundered from Belarusian libraries by the ERR, but the other half had been plundered by the ERR in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and ended the war in the ERR Silesia Center in Ratibor. Many of those, quote, twice plundered, unquote, books are still in Minsk. Some were forwarded to Moscow. Only a handful of those returned to the West, unquote. In fact, even well into the 2000s, quote, Russia has been refusing restitution, except in a few cases where there was serious barter in exchange, end quote. That does not shock me. I'm sure it didn't shock me then, but right now it's 2024 and there is a war in Ukraine. I'm sure you've heard of it. I have to wonder if there are any trophy brigades there now. Restitution of cultural treasures by Western allies took on a very different character. The most notable example of the Western Allies' efforts to preserve cultural treasures and return them to their rightful owners was the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, otherwise known as the MFA&A or the MFAA. The MFAA program was established in 1943 by the U.S. government's Roberts Commission and was charged with the task of, quote, protecting cultural treasures in European war zones, end quote. The MFAA would operate in Europe well after the war, up to 1951. The first MFAA members, a mere 12 men, included, quote, scholars, artists, museum curators, and architects. Interestingly, the MFAA did not receive a professional librarian until 1945. I seem to remember this and being kind of shocked. From 1943 until the end of the war, the MFAA's monuments men worked throughout Europe, sometimes behind the lines and other times progressing with troops at the front. Although they required essential supplies such as cameras and transportation, these supplies rarely materialized. Many of the men took to procuring their own cameras. George Stout, a leader among the monuments men, even procured his own automobile, an abandoned German Volkswagen. Despite facing shortages of supplies and lacking any real authority over combat troops, the monuments men succeeded in locating hundreds of Nazi repositories of stolen goods. For instance, monuments men Robert Posey and Lincoln Kirstein, who had also been the first to enter the mine at Althaus, made one of the largest single finds of any by the MFAA. In April 1945, they found 6 repositories in the town of Hungen. These repositories held hundreds of thousands of volumes, as well as the most precious of Europe's Jewish archives. These and other finds by the MFAA show that their contribution to the protection of culture during World War II was measurable. During the post-war period, the MFAA shifted its focus to restitution and, quote, temporary facilities at Munich, Wiesbaden, Marburg, and Offenbach, I remember Offenbach, became known as the Allied collecting points, and each had its own restitution specialty. The Offenbach Depot was established at the suggestion of the MFAA's first librarian, Leslie Erlin Post, in 1946. Prior to suggesting the creation of Offenbach, Post had traveled on average 1,000 miles per week between, quote, all of the known collecting points, libraries, archives, and repositories, end quote, during his preliminary inspection. An MFAA officer, Seymour Pomeranz, was named the Offenbach's first director, and operations began slowly. Upon arrival, Pomeranz found the bombed-out German factory that housed Offenbach in deplorable condition, and that it was severely understaffed. Pomeranz made considerable contributions to the Offenbach Depot's operations. Specifically, he had the building renovated to include sorting rooms, storage rooms, and a conservation lab. Furthermore, he had his workers stop the laborious task of creating detailed catalog records for every book they sorted, and instead instituted a system of sorting based upon the book's ex libris markings alone that would be perfected under the Offenbach Depot's second director, Isaac Benkowitz. As Anne Rothfeld describes, the Benkowitz system, sorry, I'm reading a lot of German stuff, so I'm going with the WV, operated as follows. Quote, first, crated books were triaged into identifiable and unsorted items. Clearly identifiable items were grouped by the book's markings, inventoried, and shipped to their country of origin. Next, the unsorted items were divided by language or country. Staff checked these unsorted items against book markings in the ex libris albums. Last, the unidentified items were carefully researched for bibliographic and subject information, which often required the expertise of Hebrew and Slavic linguists, end quote. Okay, so when I wrote this, I was writing to librarians. If you're watching this, chances are you're not a librarian. Maybe you are. But an ex libris mark is a stamp or a sticker that goes into a book that represents the library that it is from. It could be a university library, a public library, or even a personal library. And if I stick with it, the profile picture for this channel is going to be basically an ex libris mark. I've already made it. Rothfeld further... Oops. Above I said Rothfled. I had a typo there. Rothfeld further stated that, quote, during its 4 years of operation, the Offenbach Depot handled more than 3 million items, but despite the tireless efforts of the MFA&A at Offenbach, hundreds of books were never recovered and returned to their rightful owners. The Offenbach Depot undertook the largest book restitution program ever created, and numbers alone do not clearly represent the intensity of the restitution efforts by the MFA&A. Quote, in his memoirs, an MFAA soldier named Thomas Carr Howe expressed his relief that his expertise in art conservation had meant that he would not be assigned to Offenbach. Those who did work in Offenbach expressed even deeper thoughts upon discovering books taken from Vilna, where she had studied before the war. Lucy Davidovix, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, reflected that she had, quote, a feeling akin to holiness that I was touching something sacred, end quote. The diary of Isaac Benkowitz reads, quote, "In the sorting room, I would come to a box of books which the sorters had brought together, like scattered sheep in one field. Books from a library which had been in some distant town in Poland or an extinct yeshiva. There was something sad and mournful about these volumes. I would find myself straightening out these books and arranging them in the boxes with a personal sense of tenderness, as if they had belonged to someone dear to me, someone recently deceased. Indeed, when working at Offenbach, one witnessed the aftermath of the Bibliocaust as much as those who liberated camps like Auschwitz had witnessed the aftermath of the Holocaust." Conclusion. Despite 6 decades having passed since the end of Hitler's regime, the Nazi legacy is still felt throughout the world, particularly with regards to books. Because of Hitler's regime, book burning was made, quote, "one of the taboos of the 20th century," end quote. And in the 21st century, we are deep into the book bans. Ugh. Although it cannot be said that everyone agrees with that sentiment, it is undeniable that book burning has been identified with intolerance and hatred in the modern media. For instance, the 1998 film Pleasantville shows the ignorant, quote, black and white people burning books out of fear. They are literally black and white because Pleasantville starts off as a black and white world. I'm not referring to race, color, creed, what have you. Of course, the more tangible legacy of Nazism's impact upon books is the books themselves. The human survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust, those bearing tattoos from Nazi extermination camps, will be gone within the next 50 years. The books serve as a silent witness of the Bibliocaust, those bearing the ex libris marks of their dead owners and of the ERR will remain for centuries to come. That was a deep one to start with, but it was a great experience to review it. I hope that you enjoyed it, and come back for more. I'm going to be reviewing more of my old essays and doing original research. Feel free to contact my channel and ask research questions. I have 4 kids, so I'm going to do research whenever I have the opportunity, and I will be making videos as regularly as possible. Thank you for tuning in to Watch Library. Please like, share, subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment. Thank you. Bye-bye.